Hello, everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The Cathedral in the Mist. From Marcus Chun, the fog rolled in like a living thing that October night, thick and deliberate, swallowing the highway ahead of my Peterbilt in great gray gulps. I'd been driving the I-90 corridor for 15 years, hauling everything from lumber to electronics across the northern states, and I thought I knew every mile of asphalt between Seattle and Boston. But fog has a way of making the familiar feel foreign, turning well-traveled roads into something altogether different. My CB crackled with the usual chatter at first, drivers warning each other about the thickening mist, sharing updates about visibility and road conditions. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed a steady blue, reading 2:47 a.m., and my cargo of computer components sat secure behind me, destined for a tech company in Albany. It should have been a routine run, the kind I could navigate in my sleep. The steady hum of my diesel engine provided its familiar comfort, a reliable heartbeat in the growing silence of the night. As the fog deepened, the chatter on the CB began to fade. One by one, the voices disappeared until only static remained, punctuated by the occasional burst of unintelligible words that sounded more like whispers than proper radio communication. I adjusted the antenna and fiddled with the frequency, but the silence persisted. Outside my windshield, my headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the mist, maybe 20 feet of visibility on a good stretch, sometimes less. The highway markers became harder to spot, appearing suddenly in my lights like pale ghosts before vanishing again into the gray. I slowed my speed, keeping well within the bounds of safety, my hands steady on the wheel despite the growing unease that seemed to settle in my chest. There's something about fog that makes a man feel small, isolated from the world, in a way that clear nights never do. It's as if the mist creates its own pocket of reality, separate from everything else. That's when I first heard it, barely audible above the engine noise and the whisper of tires on wet asphalt. It started as a low, resonant note that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like the distant sound of a pipe organ played in a vast, empty space. I thought at first it might be my imagination, or perhaps the weird acoustics that fog sometimes creates, making distant traffic sound strange and distorted. But as I continued driving, the sound grew more distinct, more purposeful. It was definitely organ music, slow and haunting, the kind of deep, sustained notes that make your chest vibrate with their resonance. The melody was unfamiliar, but somehow ancient, as if it had been echoing through the mist for centuries. I rolled down my window slightly, letting the cool, damp air seep into the cab, and the music became clearer still. It wasn't coming from my radio, which remained stubbornly silent, nor from any earthly source I could identify. It seemed to emanate from the fog itself. The highway began to curve more frequently, though I couldn't recall this particular stretch having so many turns. The fog played tricks with distance and direction, making it impossible to get a proper bearing on my location. My GPS showed nothing but a blank screen, the satellite signal apparently lost in the thick mist that pressed against my truck from all sides. The mile markers, when I could see them, bore numbers that didn't match my memory of this route. But fog can make a man doubt his own recollections. The organ music swelled, joined now by what sounded like a choir, voices rising and falling in harmonies that seemed to speak of things beyond human understanding. The sound was beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl, too perfect and too otherworldly for comfort. I found myself slowing further, not just for safety, but because something deep in my mind was urging caution, whispering warnings that I couldn't quite articulate. That's when the fog began to thin, just slightly, and I saw the first glimpse of something massive looming ahead. At first, I thought it might be another truck, or perhaps a building near the highway. But as I drew closer, the shape resolved into something far more extraordinary. Rising from the mist like a mountain of carved stone, a cathedral emerged, its spires and buttresses reaching up into the fog with impossible grandeur. The structure was enormous, far larger than any cathedral I'd ever seen, and it sat directly beside the highway as if it had always been there. Gothic arches soared upward, disappearing into the mist above, while intricate stonework covered every visible surface with details that seemed to shift and writhe in my headlights. The organ music now had a clear source, pouring from the massive doors that stood open like a mouth in the cathedral's facade. Warm light spilling out onto the roadway, I pulled my truck to a stop on what appeared to be a widened shoulder, though I couldn't remember seeing any indication that such a stop existed. The engine idled with its steady rumble while I stared at the impossible sight before me. Cathedrals don't simply appear beside highways, especially not cathedrals of this size and apparent age. The stonework looked weathered by centuries, stained by rain and time. Yet the warm light from within suggested that someone or something maintained it still. The music continued to pour from the open doors, and now I could see figures moving within, silhouettes against the golden light that seemed to dance rather than walk. They moved in patterns that reminded me of a formal procession, flowing from one side of the vast interior to the other in rhythm with the haunting melody. The sight was mesmerizing, drawing me forward despite every instinct that screamed warnings in the back of my mind. I found myself opening the door of my cab, stepping down onto the wet asphalt with legs that felt strangely unsteady. The fog swirled around me, carrying with it the scent of old stone and burning candles, incense and something else I couldn't identify, but that reminded me of deep places, underground spaces that had never seen sunlight. The cathedral seemed even larger from ground level, its spires lost in the mist above, its walls stretching away into the fog on either side. The figures within continued their strange dance, and as I moved closer to the open doors, I began to make out more details. They wore robes that seemed to flow like liquid shadow, and their movements had a fluid, unnatural quality that human joints could never achieve. Their song, for I could now hear that they were singing along with the organ music, consisted of words in no language I recognized, syllables that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to something primitive in my brain. I stood at the threshold of the cathedral, my work boots on the ancient stone steps, and peered into the vast interior. The space inside defied architectural logic, stretching away farther than the external walls could possibly contain. Pillars rose like fossilized trees, supporting a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadow and mist. The robed figures continued their procession around what appeared to be an altar, though the object they circled was hidden by their flowing movements and the dancing shadows cast by countless candles. The music reached a crescendo, and the figures suddenly stopped their movement, turning as one to face the doorway where I stood, though I could see no faces beneath their hoods. I felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing pressing against me with an intensity that made my vision blur. The organ music shifted, becoming deeper, more urgent, and I realized with growing horror that the melody was not welcoming but possessive, not an invitation but a summons. I stumbled backward off the steps, my heart hammering against my ribs as the robed figures began to move toward the doorway. Their approach was slow but inexorable, flowing across the stone floor like spilled ink, and the music that accompanied their movement spoke of hunger, of an emptiness that demanded to be filled. The warm light from within the cathedral began to flicker and change, taking on colors that hurt to look at, hues that existed somewhere beyond the normal spectrum of human vision. My legs found their strength then, and I ran from my truck with a desperation I'd never felt before. Behind me, the music swelled to a volume that made the ground tremble, and I could hear the sound of stone grinding against stone, as if the cathedral itself was moving, reshaping itself in response to the inhuman song. I reached my Peterbilt and hauled myself into the cab, my hands shaking as I engaged the gears and pressed the accelerator. The truck lurched forward into the fog, and I didn't dare look in my mirrors as the music faded behind me. The highway seemed to stretch and bend around me, the familiar becoming alien once again as I drove through the thick mist with no clear sense of direction or destination. My CB remained silent, my GPS continued to show nothing, and the mile markers, when I could see them, bore numbers that followed no logical sequence. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time itself seemed fluid in the fog. Eventually, the mist began to thin, revealing familiar landmarks and highway signs that matched my memory and my route. The radio that screams only once from Jake Morrison, the CB radio crackled to life at 3:17 a.m., somewhere between Bakersfield and nowhere. And that's when I first heard about the radio that screams only once. I'd been hauling freight across these desert highways for 15 years. My Peterbilt 379 cutting through the California darkness like a chrome-plated bullet, and I thought I'd heard every trucker tale worth telling. But old Pete, that's what we called him, though nobody knew his real name, had a story that made my coffee grow cold in its thermos. You boys ever come across one of them old blop-hunked radios? His weathered voice asked through the static, the kind they used to put in the fancy European cars back in the 70s. Chrome face, blue lettering, built like a brick shit. A few drivers chimed in with affirmatives, but Pete continued without waiting. Well, there's one particular radio that's been making the rounds through truck stops and salvage yards for decades now. Looks pristine, like it just rolled off the assembly line, but it's got a peculiar habit. It screams just once, and when it does, well, the transmission cut to static. And despite several attempts from various drivers to reach old Pete, he never came back on the channel. I thought about that conversation for the next 3 days as I made my deliveries up and down the coast. the Pacific Ocean gleaming like hammered silver in my side mirrors during the day, giving way to an endless black void at night. There was something about Pete's tone that stuck with me, a kind of resigned certainty that suggested he knew more about that radio than he was letting on. When I rolled into Mickey's Truck Plaza outside of Fresno on Thursday evening, the autumn air crisp with the promise of an early winter, I found myself scanning the small electronics section they kept. Near the shower stalls, Mickey's was one of those old-school truck stops that still felt like it belonged to the drivers rather than some corporate chain. The neon signs flickered with that familiar electric buzz, casting everything in alternating shades of pink and blue, while the smell of diesel fuel and coffee mixed with the distant aroma of hamburgers from the attached diner. I was browsing through a box of used CB equipment, looking for a backup mic, when my fingers closed around something solid and cold. The radio was exactly as old Pete had described it, a blaupunkt Frankfurt, its chrome face reflecting the overhead fluorescence like a mirror, the blue lettering so crisp it might have been painted yesterday. The weight of it surprised me. These old German radios were built to last, with steel cases and components that put modern electronics to shame. The price tag read $15, which seemed almost insultingly low for something in such perfect condition. "You interested in that old thing?" Mickey himself appeared beside me, his considerable bulk moving with surprising stealth. He was wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag, leaving dark smears across his fingers. "Been sitting in that box for months now. Previous owner said it worked fine, but," he shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying more unease than his words. "But what?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. Mickey's eyes darted around the store before settling back on mine. "Said it made a noise sometimes, just once in a while. Probably just needs the tubes checked. You know how these old radios can be." But his voice carried that same note of uncertainty I'd heard from old Pete. And when I handed him the $15, he seemed almost relieved to see it go back in my cab. I mounted the blaupunkt beneath my CB radio, running the power cables to my auxiliary battery setup. The installation was straightforward enough. These old radios were designed when automotive electrical systems were simple affairs, before computers and sensors complicated every connection. As I worked, the wind picked up outside, sending tumbleweeds skittering across the parking lot and moaning through the gaps in my trailer doors. The sound was lonely and hollow, like the desert itself was sighing. I fired up my Pete around midnight, the Caterpillar engine settling into its familiar rumble as I pulled back onto Highway 99. The radio came alive with a soft amber glow, its dial face beautiful in the darkness of my cab. I spun through the AM band, picking up the usual collection of late-night talk shows, distant music stations fading in and out, and the occasional burst of Spanish from stations south of the border. Everything seemed perfectly normal. For the next 2 weeks, the blaupunkt performed flawlessly. Its reception was actually superior to most modern radios, pulling in clear signals from stations hundreds of miles away. During the lonely hours between midnight and dawn, when the highways belonged to us truckers and the occasional insomniac in a passenger car, I found myself listening to everything from classical music, broadcasts from San Francisco, to late-night jazz shows out of Los Angeles. The radio became my companion, its warm glow and rich audio making those endless miles pass more pleasantly. I was 3 weeks into owning the Blaupunkt when I first heard it scream. I was running southbound on Interstate 5. Somewhere in the vast emptiness between Stockton and Bakersfield, when the music suddenly cut out. For a moment, there was only the soft hiss of static, the kind of white noise that can lull a tired driver to sleep if he's not careful. Then, without any warning whatsoever, a sound erupted from the radio that made my blood freeze in my veins. It wasn't human. That much was immediately clear. But it wasn't animal either, or mechanical, or anything I could categorize in my mind. The closest comparison I could make was to imagine the sound of pure anguish given voice, a cry of such desperate, overwhelming terror that it seemed to bypass my ears entirely and strike directly at some primitive part of my brain. The scream lasted perhaps 3 seconds, rising and falling in pitch like a living thing in mortal agony, before cutting off as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the scream itself. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, and I realized I'd unconsciously pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my rig up to nearly 80 miles per hour in my instinctive desire to flee from whatever had produced that horrific sound. I forced myself to slow down, checking my mirrors for any sign of other vehicles, but the highway stretched empty in both directions. My headlights carving through the darkness like searchlights seeking answers in the void. I pulled off at the next truck stop, a small place called Desert Rose that catered mostly to locals and the occasional lost tourist. My hands were still shaking as I poured coffee from the thermos, the familiar ritual helping to steady my nerves. I tried to rationalize what I'd heard. Perhaps it had been some kind of radio interference, or a malfunction in the old tubes, or even a prank broadcast from someone with a twisted sense of humor. But deep down, I knew those explanations fell short of the truth. Over the following days, I found myself simultaneously dreading and anticipating another occurrence. I would catch myself staring at the radio's amber glow, waiting for that moment when the music would cut out and the static would begin. But the Blaupunkt remained silent, functioning perfectly in every way, as if nothing had ever happened. I began to wonder if I'd imagined the entire episode, if the combination of fatigue and too much caffeine had conjured the scream out of ordinary radio static. It was during a conversation with another driver at a Petro in Bakersfield that I learned I wasn't alone in my experience. Roy Hendricks, a veteran hauler from Oklahoma, overheard me describing the radio to another driver and pulled me aside with an urgency that immediately caught my attention. "You didn't buy that thing from Mickey's, did you?" he asked, his weather-beaten face creased with concern. When I nodded, he shook his head slowly. "Son, I owned that exact same radio about 2 years ago. Got it from a salvage yard in Phoenix. Beautiful condition, worked like a dream. Until it screamed." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "That sound, it ain't natural, and it ain't random either." Roy explained that he'd done some research after his own encounter with the screaming radio, tracking down previous owners through bill of sale records and word-of-mouth connections in the trucking community. What he found disturbed him enough that he'd sold the radio at a loss just to get it out of his cab. Every owner reported the same experience, or months of perfect operation followed by a single, terrifying scream that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the normal spectrum of human experience. "The thing is," Roy continued, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard, "every single driver who owned that radio had something happen to them within a month of hearing the scream. Accidents, mostly. Not fatal ones, but close calls that shouldn't have happened to experienced drivers. The voice I used to know, asterisk from Markesta Interstate, stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the October moon. And I'd been driving this route between Phoenix and Albuquerque for nearly 15 years without picking up a hitchhiker. Company policy was clear about that. And besides, you hear stories. But when I saw her standing there at the rest stop, just outside Flagstaff, something about her posture made me slow the rig down. She had her thumb out, sure enough, but she wasn't looking at the road. She was staring up at the sky like she was reading something written in the stars. The air brakes hissed as I pulled over, and I rolled down the passenger window. The October wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something sweet like honeysuckle, though I'd never known honeysuckle to bloom this late in the year. She approached the cab with deliberate steps, each footfall crunching softly on the gravel. When she looked up at me, I felt a strange recognition tug at the corners of my mind, though I was certain I'd never seen her face before. She had dark hair that seemed to catch moonlight in impossible ways, and her eyes reflected the glow of my running lights, like mirrors. "I need to get to Santa Fe," she said, and that's when the chill ran down my spine. Her voice was familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. It wasn't just similar to someone I knew. It was exact, like a recording played back with perfect fidelity. The voice belonged to my sister, Sarah, who'd been dead for 7 years. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, feeling the engine's steady rumble beneath me, while my mind tried to make sense of what I'd just heard. The woman standing beside my truck didn't look anything like Sarah. She was taller, older, with different colored eyes and a face I didn't recognize. But when she spoke again, asking if I was all right, it was Sarah's voice that came from her lips, complete with that slight rasp she'd developed after too many years of cigarettes. "Yeah, I'm fine," I managed to say, though my voice came out rougher than I intended. "Hop in." She climbed up into the cab with fluid grace, settling into the passenger seat like she belonged there. As I pulled back onto the interstate, I kept stealing glances at her in the dashboard lights. Her profile was all wrong for Sarah. The nose too straight, the jawline too angular, but every word she spoke sent shivers through me because it was my sister's voice, down to the way she pronounced her vowels and the rhythm of her speech. "Beautiful night," she said, gazing out at the star-scattered sky. Sarah always loved nights like this. My hands clenched the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I hadn't mentioned Sarah's name, hadn't said anything about having a sister. The woman was looking straight ahead now, her reflection ghost-like in the windshield glass. The heater was running, but the cab felt cold, and I could see my breath starting to mist in the air. "How do you know that name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She turned to look at me then, and for just a moment, in the green glow of the instrument panel, her features seemed to shift. The nose looked smaller, the eyes a different shape, and I could have sworn I saw Sarah's face looking back at me. But when I blinked, she was herself again, this stranger with my sister's voice. "Everyone's got a Sarah in their life," she said, with a laugh that made my blood freeze. It was the exact laugh Sarah used to make when she was deflecting, when she didn't want to answer a direct question. It's a common name. Miles rolled by under the humming tires, and she began to tell stories in Sarah's voice. Stories about growing up in small desert towns, about learning to drive in parking lots behind abandoned shopping centers, about the way the air smelled different before a storm in the high country. They weren't Sarah's stories, not exactly, but they felt like memories that could have belonged to her, like parallel experiences from a life that might have been. The radio was playing soft country music, but underneath the music I began to hear whispers, voices too low to make out words. I reached over to adjust the volume, but the woman's hand caught my wrist. Her skin was cold, colder than the night air, and her grip was stronger than it should have been. "Leave it," she said, in Sarah's voice. "Sometimes the quiet sounds are the most important ones." I pulled my hand back and focused on the road, but the whispers seemed to be getting louder. They weren't coming from the radio anymore. They were coming from everywhere, from the walls of the cab, from the air itself. And gradually, I began to recognize voices in that soft susurrus of sound. My mother, speaking words I couldn't quite catch. My father, humming a tune I remembered from childhood. And underneath it all, Sarah's voice, the real Sarah's voice, calling my name. "You hear them too," the woman said, and it wasn't a question. She was watching me with eyes that seemed to hold depths I couldn't fathom. They're always there, just at the edge of hearing. "The voices of the people we've lost," I whispered. She smiled, and for a moment her smile was Sarah's smile, crooked and mischievous and heartbreakingly familiar. "I'm a passenger, Marcus. Just someone who needs a ride." The miles stretched on, and the whispers grew louder. I began to hear full sentences, conversations from years past drifting through the cab like ghosts made of sound. Sarah's voice was strongest among them, and I found myself remembering the last time I'd spoken to her, 3 days before the accident. We'd argued about something stupid, something I couldn't even remember now, and I'd hung up angry. I'd meant to call her back, meant to make things right, but I'd waited too long. "She forgives you," the woman said, reading my thoughts. "She always forgave you, even when she was angry." Tears were running down my cheeks now, though I didn't remember starting to cry. The highway blurred in my vision, and I had to blink hard to keep the rig steady. The woman reached over and touched my shoulder, and her touch was so cold it burned. "Pull over," she said gently, using Sarah's voice to speak words of comfort I'd longed to hear. "It's all right, Marcus. You can rest." I wanted to pull over, wanted to stop driving and listen to Sarah's voice for as long as this strange woman would let me. But something deep in my mind was screaming warnings, telling me that stopping would be the worst mistake I could make. The whispers were getting louder, becoming a roar of voices calling my name, begging me to join them, to stop fighting and let go. "No," I said through gritted teeth. "I'm not stopping." The woman's expression changed, her borrowed features shifting into something cold and hungry. "You miss her," she said. And now Sarah's voice carried a cruel edge it had never held in life. "You miss her so much, it's eating you alive. Wouldn't you like to see her again?" The cab was freezing now, so cold that frost was forming on the inside of the windows. The whispers had become shouts, a chorus of the dead, but I kept driving, kept pushing forward through the supernatural cold and the voices that clawed at my mind. "She's not here," I said firmly. "Sarah's not here, and you're not her." The thing wearing the stranger's face laughed with Sarah's voice. But the laugh was wrong now, distorted and echoing. How can you be so sure? How do you know I'm not exactly who you think I am? I didn't answer, but I pressed harder on the accelerator. The big rig picked up speed, racing through the night toward the distant glow of Santa Fe. The faster I drove, the quieter the whispers became, and gradually the terrible cold began to recede. When I looked over at the passenger seat, the woman was flickering like a bad television signal. Her face kept changing, cycling through features I didn't recognize. But her voice remained constant, remained Sarah's voice pleading with me to stop, to listen, to believe. Almost there, I muttered, more to myself than to her. The lights of Santa Fe appeared on the horizon like a promise of safety, and as we entered the city limits, the woman began to fade. She was translucent now, barely visible in the dashboard lights, but her voice was as clear as ever. "Thank you for the ride, Marcus," she said, with Sarah's warm laugh. "Maybe I'll see you again sometime." I pulled into the first truck stop I saw and sat there in the parking lot, engine idling, staring at the empty passenger seat. The cab was warm again, the whispers gone, the only sound, the familiar rumble of the diesel engine. The choir in the cargo from Marcus, Washington, the first time I heard gospel music humming from my trailer. I thought maybe someone had left a radio on at the loading dock. 3 days into hauling that particular freight from Memphis to Portland, though I knew something wasn't right about what I was carrying. Let me back up a bit. I've been running long haul for 22 years, driving everything from refrigerated produce to heavy machinery across this country's endless highways. My rig is a 2019 Peterbilt 379 with a sleeper cab that's become more home to me than the apartment I keep in Little Rock. The engine purrs like a contented cat, and I know every sound she makes, every vibration that travels through the frame when something's off. What I started hearing on that October run wasn't coming from my truck. The load came through a broker I'd worked with before, seemingly straightforward enough. Church supplies and furniture, heading to a new congregation in Oregon that was setting up shop in an old warehouse. Pews, hymnals, a piano, some kind of organ, boxes of religious books and artifacts. The manifest listed everything neat and proper. Nothing unusual about the weight distribution or the pickup location at a church supply company just outside Memphis. The folks loading me up were quiet, efficient, and paid in advance. Cash money, which always makes a driver happy. I pulled out just after sunset, the autumn air crisp with that particular bite that promises winter isn't far behind. The interstate stretched ahead like a ribbon of possibility, dotted with the familiar constellation of truck stops and rest areas that mark the geography of a trucker's world. My CB crackled with the usual chatter, drivers warning each other about speed traps and weather conditions. The comforting background noise of the road brotherhood that keeps you company through the long, dark miles. Somewhere past Little Rock, maybe 2 hours into Arkansas, I first noticed the humming. It was so faint at first that I thought it might be wind whistling through a gap in the trailer seals, or maybe feedback from the CB radio. Just a low, barely perceptible sound that seemed to rise and fall with a rhythm I couldn't quite place. I adjusted the radio, checked the CB, even pulled over at a way station to walk around the rig and listen. But everything seemed normal. The trailer was sealed tight. No obvious damage or loose panels that might catch the wind. Back on the road, the humming continued, and gradually I began to recognize something familiar in its cadence. It reminded me of the way voices sound when they're singing together in harmony, the way the individual notes blend into something larger than their parts. Growing up, my grandmother had dragged me to church every Sunday, and I remembered how the congregation's voices would create this kind of unified sound, especially during the old spirituals that seemed to make the very walls of the sanctuary vibrate with devotion. The miles rolled by, and the humming grew more distinct. By the time I crossed into Oklahoma, I could swear I was hearing actual voices, though the words remained just beyond comprehension, like trying to understand a conversation in the next room. The sound seemed to be coming from directly behind my cab, from the front section of the trailer where the manifests indicated they'd loaded the piano and organ. I tried turning up my radio to drown it out, cycling through country stations and talk radio, but somehow the humming seemed to weave itself around whatever I was listening to, harmonizing with steel guitar and blending with late-night call-in shows in ways that made my skin crawl. There was something too perfect about it, too coordinated, as if whatever was making that sound was actively listening and responding to the music from my speakers at a truck stop outside Oklahoma City. I called the broker to ask about the specific items I was hauling. The church organ, he told me, was apparently some kind of antique built in the 1920s for a congregation in rural Mississippi. The church had closed down decades ago, and the organ had sat unused in the abandoned building until recently, when the new Oregon church had purchased it, along with other salvaged items. He didn't know much more than that, seemed a little annoyed that I was bothering him with questions about freight that was already loaded and rolling. I'd grabbed a coffee and walked around to the back of my trailer, pressing my ear against the aluminum walls. The humming was definitely stronger there. A complex weaving of voices that seemed to be singing something that resembled Amazing Grace, though the melody was somehow wrong, twisted into variations that made the familiar hymn sound alien and unsettling. The voices seemed to notice when I was listening, growing slightly louder, as if they were trying to communicate something to me. Sleep came hard that night in the truck stop parking lot. Every time I started to drift off, the humming would swell. Not loud enough to be truly disruptive, but persistent enough to keep pulling me back to consciousness. I found myself straining to make out the words, and occasionally I thought I could hear individual voices within the choir, a soprano that soared above the others, a bass that seemed to rumble through the trailer floor and into my sleeper cab. The second day brought me through the Oklahoma Panhandle and into the high plains of Colorado. The landscape opening up into those vast spaces that can make a driver feel both free and utterly alone. The humming continued, growing more complex as the hours passed. What had started as simple harmonies was becoming intricate musical arrangements, spirituals flowing into contemporary gospel, then shifting into songs I didn't recognize but that felt ancient and deeply rooted in traditions. I could only guess at dot. The strangest part was how the music seemed to respond to my driving. When I accelerated up long grades, the tempo would increase, voices rising in what sounded almost like encouragement. During the long descents where I had to rely on engine braking and careful speed control, the humming would slow to a more measured pace, like a congregation settling into a solemn hymn. if I hit construction zones or traffic slowdowns. The voices would drop to whispered harmonies that felt almost conspiratorial, as if they were sharing secrets about the road ahead. I tried explaining it to another driver over the CB, a woman I'd talked with off and on for years, who ran similar routes. She listened to my description of the phantom choir in my trailer and suggested maybe I was picking up some kind of radio interference, or possibly some electronic device in the freight that was malfunctioning. But when I asked her to follow me for a few miles and listen, she came back on the radio, sounding puzzled and a little disturbed. She could hear it too, she said, a faint but unmistakable sound of voices singing gospel music, coming from my trailer as I rolled down the interstate that evening, parked at a rest area in the Colorado Rockies. I decided to open the trailer and take a look at what I was hauling. I knew it was against protocol to break the seals without authorization, but the humming had grown so loud and persistent that I was starting to question my own sanity. Using my flashlight to cut through the darkness inside the trailer, I could see the organ near the front, a massive wooden instrument with elaborate carved details and rows of pipes that gleamed dully in the light beam. The moment my flashlight beam hit the organ, the humming stopped completely. The sudden silence was somehow more unnerving than the music had been. A vacuum of sound that seemed to press against my ear. I approached the instrument carefully, noting the craftsmanship that had gone into its construction, the way the wood had aged to a deep, rich patina that spoke of decades of use and care. The bench was positioned as if someone had just finished playing, and when I reached out to touch the keys, they were warm despite the cool mountain air. Behind the organ, I found boxes of hymnals, their leather covers cracked with age, and what appeared to be church records dating back to the 1920s. The congregation these items had come from was called the Mount Olive Baptist Church, located in a small Mississippi Delta town that I'd never heard of. Flipping through one of the record books by flashlight, I found references to a fire in 1943 that had killed 17 members of the choir during a Wednesday evening service, and mentions of strange occurrences in the years that followed before the church was finally abandoned. I closed the trailer quickly, but the damage was done. Now I knew what I was carrying, and the knowledge made the return of the humming, which started up again the moment I sealed the doors, infinitely more disturbing. The voices seemed different now, more personal, as if they knew I had seen their belongings and were trying to tell me their stories. I could swear I heard children's voices among the adults, high and sweet and heartbreaking in their clarity. The final day of the run took me through Utah and into Oregon, the landscape changing from mountain peaks to high desert to the green valleys of the Pacific Northwest. The choir in my trailer had grown bolder, their harmonies now loud enough that other drivers were commenting on them over the CB, asking if I had my radio turned up too high or if I was playing some kind of gospel music through external speakers. I had stopped trying to explain what was really happening. Voices in the static from Jake Whitmore, the CB radio, had been crackling with strange noises for the better part of 3 hours as I drove my Peterbilt through the endless stretch of Nevada desert. Static fills the cab with its familiar white noise, a companion to most long-haul truckers like myself. But tonight something felt different about the electric whispers dancing between stations. The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m., and Highway 50 stretched ahead like a ribbon of asphalt, cutting through absolute darkness. My headlights carving twin tunnels through the void. I'd been running this route between Reno and Salt Lake City for nearly 15 years, hauling electronics and machinery parts for a company that paid well enough to keep me coming back. The desert at night had always held a certain peace for me. The way the stars seemed close enough to touch, and the silence wrapped around my 18-wheeler like a protective blanket. But tonight, the static seemed more insistent, more alive somehow, pulsing with rhythms that reminded me uncomfortably of breathing. The wind had picked up around midnight, sending tumbleweeds skittering across the highway like ghostly dancers, their shadows playing tricks in my peripheral vision. My CB radio, a reliable Cobra 29 that had served me faithfully for over a decade, kept picking up fragments of conversations from other truckers scattered across the western states. Usually, these voices provided comfort during the lonely hours. Familiar calcines and good-humored banter about traffic conditions and truck stop coffee. But the voices tonight seemed distorted, their words stretching and warping as if filtered through water or thick glass. As I crested a small hill, the static suddenly cleared, and a voice came through with crystalline clarity that made me jump in my worn leather seat. The voice was that of a young woman, her words carrying a desperate edge that cut through the ambient hum of my diesel engine like a knife through silk. "Please, if anyone can hear this, I need help," she said, her transmission cutting in and out with bursts of interference. "I'm lost somewhere on Highway 50, and my car broke down. There's something wrong here, something watching me from the darkness. I can see eyes reflecting in my headlights, but they're too high up to be animals. Please, somebody help me." I immediately reached for my CB handset, my thumb hovering over the talk button as I scanned the road ahead for any sign of a stranded motorist. The desert landscape remained empty, my headlights revealing nothing but sagebrush and the occasional mile marker reflecting the light back at me like tiny beacons in the wilderness. "This is Big Jake on Highway 50 eastbound," I called into the microphone. "I copy your distress call. What's your location? Can you see any mile markers or landmarks?" The static resumed its chaotic dance across the speakers, swallowing my words and offering nothing but electronic snow in response. I tried again, adjusting the squelch and scanning different channels. But the woman's voice had vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The wind outside had grown stronger, rocking my trailer slightly from side to side and creating a low moaning sound that seemed to come from the desert itself. 20 minutes passed before the voice returned, this time even more urgent, her words tumbling over each other in barely controlled panic. "They're getting closer now," she whispered, and I had to turn up the volume to catch her words. "I can hear them moving around my car, scratching at the metal with what sounds like claws or fingernails. There are so many of them, and they're making these horrible clicking noises with their mouths. Oh God, one of them is looking right at me through the passenger window." My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my rig faster through the night as I desperately searched for any sign of trouble ahead. The speedometer climbed past 75, faster than I normally drove on these desert roads, but the urgency in the woman's voice compelled me forward. I tried calling out to her again, identifying myself and asking for more specific location information. But once again my transmissions seemed to disappear into the static-filled void. The landscape around me began to feel more oppressive. As I drove deeper into the night, the familiar comfort of the desert transforming into something alien and threatening. Shadows seemed to move independently of their sources, and more than once I caught myself checking my mirrors for shapes that shouldn't be there. The CB continued its electronic chatter, picking up fragments of other conversations that seemed to drift in and out of reality like half-remembered dreams. The doors won't start. The woman's voice suddenly burst through the speakers again, her words distorted by what sounded like interference, or perhaps tears. I mean, the car won't start. The engine just clicks when I turn the key, and the battery seems fine because the radio still works. They're surrounding the car now, and I can see their shapes moving in the darkness. They're tall, much taller than people should be, and they move wrong, like their joints bend in directions that don't make sense. I found myself leaning forward in my seat, straining to see further into the darkness beyond my headlights, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. The rational part of my mind suggested that this might be some kind of hoax, or perhaps a late-night radio drama bleeding over into the CB frequencies. But the raw terror in the woman's voice felt too genuine to be manufactured. Listen to me. I called into the handset, hoping somehow she could hear me, even though she hadn't responded to my previous attempts. Try to stay calm and keep your doors locked. I'm driving eastbound on Highway 50, and I'll find you. Can you honk your horn or flash your lights to help me locate you? The static that followed seemed different somehow, more structured, as if the random electronic noise was trying to form patterns, or maybe even words. I found myself listening more intently to the chaos between stations, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me, or if there really were voices hidden in the white noise, whispered conversations in languages I couldn't identify. When the woman's voice returned, it carried a note of absolute terror that made my blood run cold. They're trying the door handles now, she whispered, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear her over the ambient noise of my truck. One of them has pressed its face against the driver's side window, and its eyes are completely black, like looking into deep water at night. Its skin is pale and seems to glow slightly, and when it breathes on the glass, it doesn't fog up like it should. I think they might not be human. I pushed my truck even harder, the diesel engine roaring with effort as I scanned every shadow and depression in the landscape for signs of a stranded vehicle. Mile markers flashed past in my peripheral vision, but the road remained stubbornly empty, stretching endlessly into the darkness ahead. The CB static had taken on an almost musical quality, rising and falling in waves that seemed to match the rhythm of my heartbeat. Suddenly, the woman screamed, a sound so filled with primal terror that it seemed to bypass my ears and strike directly at some primitive part of my brain. The scream was followed by the sounds of breaking glass and what might have been claws scraping against metal, then silence more complete and terrible than any sound. "Hello, hello, are you there?" I shouted into the microphone, my voice cracking with urgency. "What's happening? Please respond." But the CB had returned to its random static, the electronic snow offering no clues about the fate of the woman whose voice had filled my cab with such desperate fear. I continued, driving eastbound, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the endless darkness on either side, searching for any sign of what might have transpired in the desert night. As dawn began to paint the eastern horizon with faint streaks of gold and pink, I finally pulled into a truck stop in Eerie, Nevada, my nerves frayed and my hands shaking slightly as I poured coffee from the perpetually brewing pot near the fuel desk. I asked the clerk, a weathered man in his 60s, who looked like he'd seen everything the desert could offer, if he'd heard any reports of stranded motorists or accidents on Highway 50 during the night. He shook his head slowly, studying my face with the knowing look of someone who'd listened to too many trucker stories over the years. "Road's been quiet all night," he said, refilling my cup without being asked. "Highway Patrol hasn't reported anything unusual, and you're the first eastbound driver I've seen since around midnight." I thanked him and returned to my truck, but before starting the engine, I picked up my CB handset one more time and tried calling out to the woman whose voice had haunted my journey through the darkness. The morning air was clear and still, perfect conditions for radio transmission. But my calls received no response except the eternal dance of static between stations as I pulled back onto Highway 50 to continue my run toward Salt Lake City. The CB radio crackled to life one final time. The desert that follows from Marcus Chunda, rear camera on my Peterbilt, has saved me from more backing accidents than I can count. But tonight, it's showing me something that shouldn't exist. I've been hauling freight across the Southwest for 15 years, and I know these highways like the lines on my weathered hands. The stretch of Interstate 40 between Flagstaff and Albuquerque is familiar territory. A ribbon of asphalt cutting through high desert scrubland, dotted with juniper and sage. But according to my backup camera, there's nothing behind me but endless sand dunes, stretching to a horizon that seems to shimmer even in the darkness. The trouble started about 2 hours ago when I pulled into the truck stop in Grants, New Mexico. It was one of those newer places with LED lighting that makes everything look surgical and cold. The kind of fluorescent brightness that hurts your eyes after hours of staring into headlight glare. I needed fuel and a quick equipment check before the final push to Albuquerque. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a couple of other rigs and a lone RV with out-of-state plates. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of weather moving in from the west. While the diesel pumped, I walked around the truck, doing my routine inspection. The Peterbilt is an older model, built solid when they still made them to last, with over 800,000 miles on the odometer and plenty of fight left in her. The rear camera system was an aftermarket addition I'd installed myself 3 years back, mounted above the trailer doors with a clear view of whatever was behind me. The monitor sits on my dashboard, usually showing nothing more interesting than empty highway or the occasional tailgater who doesn't understand stopping distances. That's when I first noticed something was wrong. I was adjusting the trailer tandems when I glanced at the monitor out of habit, and instead of seeing the truck stop parking lot and the desert hills beyond, the screen showed rolling sand dunes under a star-filled sky. The image was crystal clear, high definition, but it wasn't showing what should have been there. I figured it was some kind of interference or a loose connection, so I gave the monitor a tap and checked the camera housing. Everything looked secure, and when I looked at the screen again, it showed the parking lot just like it should. I finished fueling and grabbed a coffee from inside, black and strong enough to keep me alert for the remaining 100 miles to my delivery point. The clerk was a young woman with tired eyes who barely looked up from her magazine as she rang up my purchase. Through the windows, I could see storm clouds building on the horizon, their edges lit by occasional flickers of lightning still too distant to hear. The weather report on the radio had mentioned possible thunderstorms moving through the area, but nothing severe enough to delay travel. Back on the highway, I settled into the familiar rhythm of long-haul driving. The engine hummed its steady diesel song, and my CB radio occasionally crackled with chatter from other drivers reporting road conditions ahead. The landscape rolled past in shades of gray and black, the high desert punctuated by the occasional glow of a distant ranch house, or the red eyes of radio towers blinking their warnings to aircraft. It's a peaceful kind of solitude, being alone with the road and your thoughts, watching the miles tick by on the odometer. About 20 minutes out of Grants, I noticed the rear camera monitor flickering. When I glanced down at it, expecting to see the empty highway behind me, I saw sand dunes again. This time, the image didn't change when I looked away and back. The screen showed an endless expanse of pale sand under starlight, with wind patterns creating ripples across the surface that seemed to shift and move even as I watched. There was something hypnotic about it, the way the dunes seemed to breathe and flow like a slow ocean frozen in time. I tried adjusting the monitor settings, thinking maybe some electromagnetic interference was causing the camera to pick up a signal from somewhere else. Truckers sometimes hear CB conversations from hundreds of miles away when atmospheric conditions are right. So maybe something similar was happening with the camera system, but every setting showed the same impossible desert. And when I checked my mirrors, they reflected exactly what they should. The dark highway stretching behind me with my trailer lights glowing red in the distance. The storm was moving in faster than the weather report had predicted. Within minutes, the first raindrops began spattering against my windshield, each drop catching the light from my running lights before sliding away into the darkness. I turned on the wipers and reduced my speed slightly, experience having taught me to respect sudden weather changes in desert country, where flash floods can turn dry arroyos into raging torrents in minutes. The radio weather update confirmed what I could see building around me, a line of thunderstorms moving northeast with potential for heavy rain and strong winds, but the rear camera still showed clear skies and endless sand. As I watched the monitor between glances at the road ahead, I began to notice details that made my skin crawl. There were tracks in the sand, not tire tracks or footprints, but strange furrows that seemed to writhe and twist as they disappeared over the dunes. Sometimes I caught glimpses of movement at the edge of the frame, shadows that didn't match any of the static dune formations, as if something large was moving just outside the camera's field of view. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the cab roof with increasing intensity. Lightning flickered more frequently, illuminating the desert landscape in stark white snapshots that revealed the true terrain around me. Rocky hills and scrub vegetation, nothing like the Saharan wasteland displayed on my monitor. Thunder rolled across the sky with increasing frequency, sometimes close enough to feel the vibration through the truck's frame. I had to slow down further, as the rain began to affect visibility. My headlights reflecting off sheets of water that turned the highway into a river of light 20 miles outside Albuquerque. I crested a hill and saw the city's glow spread across the valley below. A welcome sight after hours of empty highway. But when I looked at the rear camera monitor, the desert had changed. The sand dunes were closer to the camera now, as if whatever was creating this impossible image was approaching. I could see the individual grains shifting in the wind, and those strange tracks were more numerous, crisscrossing the sand in patterns that hurt to follow with my eyes. More disturbing, I was beginning to see what was making the tracks. They weren't animals, at least not any animals I could identify. The shapes moved through the sand like swimmers moving through water, sometimes breaking the surface just enough to reveal dark, glistening forms before disappearing back into the depths of the dunes. They seemed to be following the truck, keeping pace with my speed even as I varied the throttle to test my growing suspicion. When I accelerated, they moved faster. When I slowed down, they slowed down. They were definitely tracking me. Though how something in an impossible desert could be following my physical truck was a question that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The storm was reaching its peak intensity now, with rain coming down in torrents that overwhelmed my wipers and reduced visibility to mere yards ahead of the truck. I had to slow to a crawl, using the shoulder reflectors to maintain my lane position as the highway became a dangerous corridor between walls of water. Other vehicles had pulled over to wait out the worst of it, their hazard lights blinking like maritime distress signals through the downpour. The smart thing would have been to stop and wait, but something about those shapes in the sand made me reluctant to remain stationary. That's when I noticed the sand beginning to spill over the edges of the monitor screen. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, fatigue and stress creating hallucinations in my peripheral vision. But when I looked directly at the monitor, I could see grains of sand scattered around its frame, and more were appearing with each passing second. The sand was fine and pale, nothing like the red clay and rocky soil of the New Mexico high desert. It felt cold when I brushed it away from the dashboard, cold and somehow electric, leaving my fingertips tingling with an unpleasant sensation. The shapes in the desert were getting bolder, surfacing more frequently and staying visible longer. I caught glimpses of sinuous forms that might have been tentacles or serpentine bodies, dark against the pale sand and moving with an intelligence that was unmistakably predatory. They were circling now, creating a perimeter around some invisible point that corresponded to my truck's position. The pattern was closing in, the circles getting tighter with each revolution, and I pressed harder on the accelerator despite the dangerous driving conditions. More sand was appearing in the cab, not just around the monitor, but scattered across the seat beside me and collecting in the cup holders. The air began to taste of dust and something else, something organic and unpleasant that reminded me of low tide at the beach, all seaweed and things that lived in dark water. My CB radio was picking up strange interference now, not the usual atmospheric distortions that sometimes affect long-distance communications, but sounds that might have been voices speaking in languages that had never been human. The golden seeds from Marcasta, first thing that struck me about the old Kenworth wasn't the rust eating through its chrome or the way the cab tilted slightly to the left like a ship taking on water. It was the smell that hit me when I opened the driver's door at the auction lot outside Bakersfield, a sweet, earthy scent that reminded me of my grandmother's garden after spring rain. The auctioneer had called it a steal at $8,000, and looking at the odometer showing just under 400,000 miles, I figured I could squeeze another 100,000 out of her before she gave up the ghost completely. That first night on Interstate 40, hauling a load of furniture toward Phoenix, I discovered the source of that peculiar fragrance when I reached for my logbook in the glove compartment. Instead of the usual collection of registration papers, old receipts, and maybe a forgotten energy bar, my fingers encountered something soft and yielding. I pulled the compartment open under the dome light and found myself staring at what must have been hundreds of dandelion heads, their golden petals still vibrant despite being dried, packed so carefully into every available inch of space that they formed a perfect, undisturbed mass. The sight should have struck me as merely odd, perhaps the remnant of some previous owner's gardening hobby or a child's nature collection, gone forgotten. Instead, I felt an inexplicable chill run down my spine as I gazed at those perfectly preserved flowers. Each bloom seemed to catch and hold the cabin light in a way that made them appear almost luminous, as if they possessed some internal glow, independent of any external source. The sweet scent intensified when the compartment was open, filling the cab with an aroma so thick I could taste it on my tongue, like honey mixed with earth and something else I couldn't quite identify. I should have thrown them out right then, should have cleared that glove box and filled it with my own belongings, but something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the careful way they had been arranged. Each flower head nestled perfectly against its neighbors without a single petal disturbed. Maybe it was the thought that they represented someone's memory, some moment of joy or beauty that deserved preservation. Whatever the reason, I closed the compartment and continued down the dark highway, the Kenworth's diesel engine humming its steady rhythm beneath me. The next few weeks passed without incident, though I found myself opening the glove compartment more frequently than necessary, always under the pretense of checking my paperwork, but really just to look at those golden flowers. They never seemed to lose their color or their fragrance, never grew brittle or began to crumble as I would have expected from dried plants. If anything, they appeared to grow more vibrant with each passing day, their yellow petals deeper and richer than before, their sweet scent stronger and more complex. It was during a layover at a truck stop outside Amarillo that I first heard the story. I was sharing coffee and conversation with an older driver named Pete, who claimed to have been running these roads since the 70s. And when I mentioned my new rig, his weathered face went pale beneath his John Deere cap. He asked me to describe the truck in detail, and when I mentioned the glove box full of dandelions, he set down his coffee cup with such force that the ceramic cracked against the Formica table. Pete told me about Sarah Chen, a driver who had run the same routes I was working now, always alone, always professional, always punctual with her deliveries. She had been known for stopping along highways and back roads to pick wildflowers, which she would press and preserve in various compartments of her truck. Dandelions were her favorite, he said, because they grew everywhere and asked for nothing, thriving in the most unlikely places with a stubborn beauty that reminded her of herself. She had been found 3 months ago at the bottom of Devil's Canyon in New Mexico, her truck having somehow left the highway on a straight, clear stretch of road where no deer or mechanical failure could explain the accident. The official report blamed driver fatigue, but Pete knew better. He had seen Sarah just hours before the crash at a way station, and she had been alert and cheerful, excited about a new load that would take her through the desert wildflower country she loved. She had shown him her latest collection of pressed dandelions, carefully arranged in her glove compartment, and talked about how she planned to make them into bookmarks for her nieces back in California. The truck had been totaled in the crash and should have been scrapped, Pete insisted. But somehow it had ended up at that auction where I found it. I tried to dismiss Pete's story as highway folklore, the kind of ghost tale that truckers love to share over coffee and pie. But that night, as I climbed back into the Kenworth's cab, the sweet scent of dandelions seemed stronger than ever. I found myself checking the side mirrors more frequently, searching the darkness for headlights that might be following too close or moving in patterns that defied explanation. The engine's steady rumble, which had become a comforting constant over the past weeks, now seemed to carry an underlying rhythm that reminded me of breathing, slow and deep, and somehow too deliberately paced. My next load took me through New Mexico, and despite my best efforts to avoid it, GPS routing led me along the very stretch of highway where Sarah's accident had occurred. Devil's Canyon opened up to my right as the sun was setting, its red rock walls catching and holding the last light like cupped hands full of blood. I had planned to push through and reach Albuquerque by midnight, but as I passed the spot where Pete claimed the accident happened, the Kenworth's engine began to sputter and lose power. I managed to guide the truck to the shoulder just as it died completely, its diesel engine falling silent for the first time since I had owned it. The sudden quiet was overwhelming after hours of steady mechanical noise, broken only by the whisper of wind through the canyon and the distant call of a coyote somewhere in the gathering darkness. I tried the ignition repeatedly, but got nothing more than a weak clicking sound from the starter. My cell phone showed no signal, and the nearest town was 30 miles behind me. As I sat in the darkened cab, wondering what to do next, the glove compartment fell open on its own, spilling golden light across the seat beside me. But it wasn't the dome light illuminating those dried dandelions, I realized with growing alarm. The flowers themselves were glowing, each petal radiating a soft, warm luminescence that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. The sweet scent filled the cab so completely that I could barely breathe, and I felt a strange drowsiness creeping over me despite my fear. In that drowsy state, I began to see images that couldn't possibly be real. A woman with kind eyes and calloused hands, kneeling beside desert highways to gather wildflowers. The same woman carefully arranging her treasures in the very glove compartment I was staring at, humming softly to herself as she worked. Her joy at finding a particularly perfect dandelion, golden and full and untouched by time or weather. Her plans to share that beauty with others, to preserve these moments of simple wonder against the harsh realities of life on the road. But then the images changed, showing me her final night, the same stretch of highway where I now sat stranded. I saw her glove compartment open just as mine was now, the dandelions glowing with that same impossible light. I watched her eyes grow heavy with the same drowsiness I was fighting. her hands loosening on the steering wheel as she succumbed to whatever force those flowers represented. I saw the Kenworth drift toward the canyon's edge, gaining speed as it left the asphalt, and I understood with crystal clarity that Sarah Chen hadn't died in an accident at all. The realization shocked me back to full consciousness, and I lunged forward to slam the glove compartment shut, cutting off that hypnotic golden glow. The sweet scent began to dissipate immediately, and within moments I could think clearly again. My hands shaking, I turned the ignition key and felt a flood of relief as the engine roared back to life. Its familiar rumble, drowning out the whispers of wind that had sounded too much like voices calling from the canyon below. I drove straight through until dawn, not stopping until I reached a truck stop in Colorado, where I could think clearly under fluorescent lights, surrounded by other people. In the harsh illumination of morning, I cleaned out that glove compartment completely, gathering every last dandelion and dumping them into a dumpster behind the building. I told myself I was being rational, practical, clearing out someone else's clutter to make room for my own belongings. But as I walked back toward the I could swear I heard the wind carrying a sound like gentle weeping, and when I looked over my shoulder, a single perfect dandelion was growing through a crack in the asphalt beside the dumpster, its golden petals catching the morning light like a promise or a threat. The Devil's Breath, from Marcus Reed. The first thing you learn as a long-haul trucker is to trust your senses. And tonight, every instinct I'd honed over 23 years on the road was screaming at me to turn around. But with a deadline breathing down my neck and a cargo of medical supplies bound for Denver, turning back wasn't an option. My Peterbilt 379, Old Blue, as I called her, hummed steadily beneath me as we climbed through the Rockies on Interstate 70, her diesel engine purring like a contented cat despite the elevation. The dashboard clock glowed a steady 11:47 p.m., and the only other light came from my headlights cutting through the mountain. Darkness ahead. I'd been driving this route for over a decade, knew every curve and grade by heart, but something felt different tonight. The wind had been picking up steadily since I'd left Grand Junction, and now it was howling across the highway with an intensity that made Old Blue shudder with each gust. But it wasn't just the strength of the wind that had me uneasy. It was the smell it carried. Every time I cracked the windows to get some fresh air, the scent hit me like a physical blow, thick, acrid, sulfurous, like someone had lit 1,000 matches and mixed the smoke with rotten eggs. At first, I'd chalked it up to some kind of industrial accident, maybe a chemical plant with a leak somewhere downwind. But as the miles rolled by and the smell only grew stronger, I began to wonder if there might be something else at play. The sulfur scent was so intense now that it seemed to seep through the cab's air filtration system, coating the back of my throat with its bitter taste and making my eyes water. The CB radio crackled with static, and I reached for the handset, hoping to raise another driver who might know what was causing the stench. Breaker 19, this is Freight Dog eastbound on I-70 near mile marker 154. Anyone else smelling that sulfur in the air tonight? The radio hissed back at me with nothing but white noise, which was strange considering this was usually a busy corridor for night haulers. I tried again, switching channels, but got the same empty static each time as I crested a particularly steep grade. The wind suddenly died to complete stillness, and the absence of sound was almost more unsettling than the howling had been. In that moment of eerie calm, the sulfur smell intensified to an almost unbearable degree, so strong that I had to mouth breathe to keep from gagging. Old Blue's engine seemed to strain against something invisible, her RPMs dropping despite the steady pressure of my foot on the accelerator. That's when I saw the lights ahead, or rather, what I first took to be lights. Scattered across the highway like fallen stars were dozens of flickering yellow-orange glows, each about the size of a basketball and hovering roughly 3 feet off the asphalt. As I drew closer, I realized they weren't electric lights at all, but something that pulsed and danced like flames, though they cast no illumination on the surrounding darkness. They simply hung there in the still air, dozens of them, blocking the entire width of the highway. I downshifted and began to brake, Old Blue's air system hissing as we slowed. The sulfur smell was overwhelming now, so thick I could almost see it as a yellow haze in my headlight beams. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, and a cold sweat had broken out across my forehead despite the cab's warmth. Every rational part of my mind was searching for an explanation. Swamp gas, some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, maybe even a military exercise, but deep down, in that primitive part of the brain that still remembers when humans huddled around fires to keep the darkness at bay, I knew I was seeing something that had no place in the natural world. As Old Blue rolled to a stop about 50 yards from the nearest of the floating lights, I could see them more clearly. They weren't flames exactly, but something that resembled fire while being fundamentally different. Each one writhed and twisted as if it were alive, and occasionally they would drift slowly from one position to another, like jellyfish moving through invisible water. The sulfur smell was so intense now that it felt like breathing liquid, and I found myself taking shallow, careful breaths to avoid retching. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. The GPS showed nothing unusual about this stretch of road, just the same mountain highway I'd driven countless times before. But there was no denying what I was seeing, no explaining away the floating lights that barred my path forward. As I watched, one of them began to drift toward my truck, moving with deliberate purpose rather than random motion. The thing, and I use that word because I don't know what else to call it, approached my driver's side window, hovering there at eye level. Up close, I could see it wasn't just a simple ball of light, but something far more complex. Within its flickering orange glow, shapes seemed to move and shift, dark silhouettes that might have been reaching hands or grasping tendrils. The glass of my window began to fog over despite the dry mountain air, and I could hear a sound like distant screaming carried on a wind that no longer blew. That's when the temperature inside the cab began to rise. It started gradually, just a degree or two, but within moments, the air had become stifling hot. The sulfur smell intensified until it felt like breathing pure poison, and I realized, with growing horror, that whatever these things were, they were somehow affecting the very air around them. Old Blue's engine began to knock and ping, her cooling system working overtime against heat that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I tried to put the truck in gear and reverse away from the lights, but something was wrong with the transmission. The shifter moved freely, but nothing happened when I let out the clutch. It was as if some invisible force was holding us in place, keeping us trapped within that circle of sulfurous hell. The CB radio erupted in a burst of static so loud and harsh that I had to rip the handset away from my ear. And in that static, I could swear I heard voices, dozens of them, all screaming in agony. More of the lights began to converge on my truck, surrounding Old Blue on all sides. Where they passed, the asphalt seemed to shimmer and warp, and the yellow lines painted on the road began to bubble and smoke. The heat was becoming unbearable now, and I could taste copper blood where I'd bitten my tongue, trying not to cry out. My rational mind was still trying to find explanations. Hallucinations brought on by altitude sickness. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty exhaust system. Anything that would make sense of what I was experiencing. But then one of the lights pressed itself against my windshield, and the glass began to crack in spiderweb patterns that spread outward from the point of contact. The thing pulsed brighter, and for just an instant I saw clearly what moved within its fiery core. Faces, dozens of them, twisted in expressions of torment and rage, their mouths open in silent screams. Human faces, but wrong somehow, as if they'd been stretched and distorted by unimaginable heat. That's when Old Blue's engine died. Not sputtered, not coughed, just stopped, as if someone had thrown a switch. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the soft, crackling sound of my windshield, continuing to fracture, and the distant sound of screaming that seemed to come from the lights themselves. The temperature gauge was buried in the red, and steam was beginning to rise from somewhere under the hood. I closed my eyes and did something I hadn't done since I was a child, afraid of the dark. I prayed, not to any particular god or denomination, just a desperate plea to whatever force might be listening to get me out of this nightmare. And whether by divine intervention or sheer mechanical stubbornness, Old Blue's starter caught when I turned the key. Her engine roared to life with a sound like salvation, and suddenly the transmission was working again. I threw her into reverse and backed away from those hellish lights as fast as I dared, not caring about the steep grade or the narrow shoulder. The floating flames seemed to pursue us for a few hundred yards, drifting after the truck like lazy predators. But as the distance grew, they began to fade and lose cohesion. By the time I'd backed around the previous curve, they had vanished entirely, leaving only the lingering smell of sulfur and the memory of those tortured faces. I sat there for nearly an hour, engine running, before I worked up the courage to proceed forward again. When I did, there was nothing unusual about that stretch of highway. No scorch marks on the asphalt, no lingering odor, nothing to suggest that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. My cracked windshield was the only physical evidence that the encounter had been real. The Midnight Scrub from Jake Morrison. I've been driving 18-wheelers across this country for the better part of 20 years, and in all that time I thought I'd seen every kind of truck stop, wash bay, and roadside oddity you could imagine. The neon signs that buzz and flicker against rain-slicked asphalt, the 24-hour diners with their perpetually burnt coffee, the mechanics who work miracles with nothing but duct tape and determination. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I found on that stretch of Highway 87 outside Amarillo on a cold February night. The storm had been chasing me for the better part of 300 miles. and my rig was caked with a combination of road salt, mud, and something that looked suspiciously like dried blood from a deer strike I'd witnessed earlier that evening. The Kenworth was running fine, but the grime was so thick on my windshield that even with the wipers going full speed, visibility was becoming a genuine concern. That's when I spotted the sign emerging from the darkness like a beacon. Midnight Scrub Truck Wash, open 24/7. We remove everything. The establishment sat alone in what seemed like the middle of nowhere, surrounded by empty fields that stretched endlessly into the night. The main sign was one of those old-fashioned ones with individual bulbs spelling out the letters, though several were burned out, making it read more like Midnight, SCUB, Lowit. A smaller neon sign promised like new again in electric blue cursive that pulsed gently against the storm clouds. Something about the rhythm of that pulsing reminded me of a heartbeat, slow and steady and somehow alive. I pulled my rig into the lot, gravel crunching under the massive tires, and immediately noticed how quiet everything became. The storm that had been battering my truck for hours seemed to fade to a gentle whisper the moment I crossed some invisible threshold into the wash's territory. Even my engine seemed to idle more softly, the familiar rumble becoming almost musical in the strange calm that had settled over the place. The building itself was modest, just a small office with large windows that glowed with warm yellow light. Through them, I could see an elderly man sitting behind a counter, reading what appeared to be a leather-bound ledger. He looked up as I parked and waved with the kind of genuine friendliness that's becoming increasingly rare at these late-night stops. The wash bays stretched out behind the office, 3 enormous tunnel-style operations that could easily handle the biggest rigs on the road. I'd climbed down from the cab and felt the ground beneath my feet with unusual awareness. The asphalt was perfectly smooth, not a crack or pothole to be found, and it seemed to absorb sound in a way that made my footfalls sound muffled and distant. The air smelled clean despite the recent storm, with an underlying scent that reminded me of my grandmother's laundry room, all bleach and soap and something indefinably fresh. The old man greeted me as I entered the office, his voice warm and welcoming, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. His name tag read Henry, and his eyes were the palest blue-eyed ever seen, almost translucent. He asked about my route, commented on the weather, and made all the small talk you'd expect. But there was something in the way he looked at my truck that seemed deeper than professional interest. It was almost like he was evaluating something beyond just the surface dirt. "That's quite a coating you've got there," he said, gesturing toward my Kenworth through the window. "Road grime, salt, organic matter. Looks like you've been carrying more than just cargo." The way he said organic matter made something cold crawl up my spine, though I couldn't have explained why. I told him about the long haul from Minnesota, the storm, the general accumulation of highway debris that comes with the territory. Henry nodded thoughtfully and quoted me, a price that seemed surprisingly reasonable for such a thorough cleaning. The Midnight Special, he called it, explaining that it was their most comprehensive service. "We guarantee complete removal of all foreign substances. Your truck will look exactly like it did the day it rolled off the factory floor." Again, something in his phrasing struck me as odd, but exhaustion was making me less sharp than usual, and the promise of a spotless truck was too appealing to question. I paid in cash and drove into the first bay as directed. The entrance was larger than most, easily accommodating my rig and trailer without the usual careful maneuvering. The interior was surprisingly high-tech for such a remote location, with nozzles and brushes and equipment I didn't recognize. LED strips ran along the ceiling, providing a soft white light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The wash began normally enough. Pre-rinse sprays hit the truck from multiple angles, and I could see years' worth of accumulated grime beginning to stream away in muddy rivulets. The familiar sound of high-pressure water and mechanical brushes was oddly soothing, and I found myself relaxing for the first time in days. Through the windshield, I watched the equipment work with mechanical precision, each brush and nozzle operating in perfect synchronization. But as the process continued, I began to notice things that didn't seem quite right. The water running off my truck was darker than it should have been, almost black in some areas, and it seemed to move with unusual viscosity. More disturbing still, some of the brushes appeared to be working on areas of the truck that weren't dirty, scrubbing away at panels that had been clean to begin with. The mechanical arms moved with an almost organic fluidity, bending and reaching in ways that reminded me more of tentacles than machinery. It was then that I noticed my reflection in the side mirror beginning to change. At first, I thought it was just the distortion from water and soap. But as I watched with growing unease, I realized that my face in the mirror looked younger. The lines around my eyes were fading, the gray in my beard was darkening, and the scar on my forehead from a childhood accident was becoming less visible with each passing moment. I tried to start the engine, suddenly desperate to escape whatever was happening, but the truck wouldn't respond. The electrical system was completely dead, not even the dash lights functioning. Outside, the washing equipment had moved closer to the cab, and I could hear sounds that no machinery should make, wet, sliding noises that seemed almost hungry. The brushes that touched the windows left trails that looked less like soap and more like something organic, something alive. That's when I saw my hands. The calluses I'd built up over 2 decades of gripping steering wheels were gone. The small scars from countless minor injuries had vanished, and my skin looked like it belonged to a man half my age. But it wasn't just my hands. Looking down at myself, I could see that my entire body was changing, reverting to some earlier version of myself that I barely remembered. The horror of it hit me like a physical blow. The truck wash wasn't just removing dirt and grime. It was removing time itself. Every mile I'd driven, every experience that had marked me, every year that had shaped who I'd become was being scrubbed away like road salt. The equipment outside was working faster now, more aggressively, and through the foam and spray, I could swear I saw other things being washed away. Memories, perhaps, or pieces of life experience made somehow visible and tangible. I hammered on the horn, but no sound came out. I tried the radio, the CB, anything that might connect me to the outside world, but everything was as dead as winter. The washing seemed to be affecting the truck itself now, and I could see that the wear patterns on the dashboard were disappearing, the small dings and scratches that told the story of countless miles erasing themselves as if they had never been done. In desperation, I threw myself against the door, but it wouldn't budge. The handle moved, but it was as if the door had been welded shut. Outside, I could see Henry standing in the office window, watching with those pale, translucent eyes. He wasn't smiling anymore, and in the strange light, his face looked ancient despite his earlier appearance of ordinary old age. The transformation was accelerating now. I caught glimpses of myself in various reflective surfaces throughout the cab, and each time I looked younger, more unfamiliar. But it wasn't just physical age being removed. I could feel memories slipping away like water running off glass. The face of my ex-wife became blurry, then vanished entirely. Years of driving experience evaporated, leaving me feeling uncertain about things I'd known instinctively just moments before. Just when I thought I might disappear entirely, washed clean of everything that made me who I was, the equipment suddenly stopped. The brushes retracted, the sprays ceased, and the bay fell into an eerie silence. After what felt like an eternity, the exit door rumbled open, and my engine miraculously roared back to life. Highway of 1,000 Whispers from Jake Morrison. The first time I heard them, I thought it was just the wind cutting through my rig's weather stripping. You know how it is on those long midnight hauls when your mind starts playing tricks on you, when every sound becomes something else entirely. But the whispers on Interstate 40 between Flagstaff and Albuquerque weren't just wind, and they sure as hell weren't my imagination. I'd been driving truck for 17 years, hauling everything from furniture to medical supplies across the Southwest, and I knew every mile of that particular stretch like the back of my weathered hands. The highway cuts through some of the most desolate country you'll ever see, where the desert spreads out endless and dark under a canopy of stars so bright they make you feel small. It's the kind of road where you can drive for hours without seeing another soul, where the only company you have is the steady rumble of your diesel engine and the occasional coyote caught in your headlights. That October night started like any other. I was running late with a load of electronics bound for Santa Fe, the kind of cargo that made dispatchers nervous and drivers push a little harder than they should. My Peterbilt 379 was humming along at a steady 70, her chrome stacks gleaming in the moonlight, when I first noticed something different about the usual highway sounds. Somewhere beneath the familiar symphony of road noise and engine rhythm, there was something else, something that made the hair on my arms stand up beneath my flannel shirt. At first, it was so faint I almost dismissed it as radio interference, or maybe the distant chatter from another trucker's CB bleeding through my speakers. But as the miles rolled by, the sound grew clearer, more distinct. It was voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all talking at once in a soft murmur that seemed to rise from the asphalt itself. The whispers weren't coming through my radio or from outside the cab. They were everywhere and nowhere, like they were being carried on the very air around my truck. I eased off the throttle and rolled down my window, letting the cool desert air rush into the cab. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, though I still couldn't make out individual words. They seemed to be speaking in different languages, different accents, as if every voice belonged to someone from a different time and place. Some sounded young, almost childlike, while others carried the weight of advanced age. All of them had one thing in common, an urgency that made my chest tighten with inexplicable dread. The CB radio crackled to life, startling me from my concentration on the mysterious voices. "Eastbound Pete, you copy." The voice belonged to another driver, probably running the opposite direction. I grabbed the mic. "Yeah, I copy. This is the Blue Pete eastbound at mile marker 237. You hearing that, brother?" My grip tightened on the steering wheel. Hearing what? The voices, man. They've been going on for the last 10 miles. My wife's sleeping in the bunk, but I can barely concentrate on the road with all that chatter. So I wasn't losing my mind. That revelation brought both relief and a deeper sense of unease. Any idea what they're saying? Can't make it out. Sounds like a bunch of different conversations, all happening at once. Been driving this route for 12 years. Never heard anything like it. We talked for a few more minutes before he faded out of range, leaving me alone again with the growing chorus of whispers. I reached for my thermos of coffee, my hands trembling slightly as I poured the dark liquid into my travel mug. The caffeine helped steady my nerves, but it couldn't quiet the voices that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing mile. As I approached mile marker 250, the whispers began to change. Instead of the indistinct murmur they'd been before, I started to catch fragments of actual words and phrases. "Turn back," I heard, clearly, spoken in what sounded like an elderly woman's voice. "Not safe ahead," came another, this one from a man with a thick accent I couldn't place. "The road remembers," whispered a child, the words so clear they might have been spoken directly into my ear. My speedometer read 65, then 60, then 55, as I unconsciously slowed the rig. Every instinct I'd developed in nearly 2 decades of driving was telling me something was wrong, that I needed to find an exit and get off this stretch of highway. But the next town was still 30 miles ahead, and there weren't any truck stops or rest areas between here and there. It was just me, my rig, and 40 tons of cargo on a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desert darkness. The whispers began to organize themselves, forming what almost sounded like a conversation. I could make out multiple voices now, all talking about the road, about accidents, about people who never made it to their destinations. "Jackknifed at mile 265, one voice said clearly. "Head-on collision near the bridge," said another. "Fell asleep at the wheel. Never saw the curve coming." That's when I realized what I was hearing. These weren't random voices or some strange atmospheric phenomenon. These were the voices of people who had died on this stretch of highway. Truckers and travelers who had met their end somewhere along these 40 miles of Interstate 40. The road was haunted, not by visible spirits, but by the echoing voices of everyone who had ever taken their last breath on this particular piece of American asphalt. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel now, and I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. The voices were getting louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to warn me about something ahead. "Slow down," urged a woman's voice that sounded familiar, though I couldn't place it. "There's danger at mile 265. There's always danger at mile 265. I glanced at my GPS and felt ice form in my stomach. Mile marker 265 was less than 10 miles ahead, right where the highway curved around a series of rocky hills before descending toward the valley beyond. I'd driven that curve hundreds of times without incident, but something about it tonight felt different, charged with malevolent possibility. The whispers reached a crescendo, as I approached the curve. Dozens of voices, all talking at once, warning me, pleading with me, telling me stories of twisted metal and broken dreams. Through the cacophony, I heard the screech of brakes that weren't my own, the grinding of metal against metal, the final gasps of people who had died with words still on their lips as I rounded the curve at 40 miles per hour. My headlights swept across the guardrail and illuminated something that made me slam on the brakes. So hard, my trailer fishtailed behind me. There, stretched across both lanes of the highway, was the ghostly outline of a massive accident. I could see the translucent forms of overturned cars, a jackknifed semi, and people wandering among the wreckage with expressions of confusion and loss. But even as I watched, the scene began to fade, becoming less distinct until it was nothing more than heat shimmer rising from the asphalt. The whispers, which had reached an almost deafening volume, suddenly stopped, leaving only the sound of my diesel engine idling and my own ragged breathing. I sat there for several minutes, hands shaking, trying to process what I had just witnessed. Slowly, carefully, I eased the truck forward, half expecting to feel the crunch of debris beneath my tires. But there was nothing there, just clean asphalt reflecting my headlights. As I cleared the curve and began the descent into the valley, the whispers started again, but fainter, now more distant, as if they were receding back into whatever realm they had emerged from at the next truck stop. I pulled in and parked, too shaken to continue driving until I'd had a chance to collect myself. Over coffee in the driver's lounge, I struck up a conversation with an older driver who'd been running Southwest routes for 30 years. When I mentioned the whispers on I-40, his face went pale. "Mile 265, he said, nodding grimly. "That curve's taken more drivers than any other spot in 3 states. Started in the 50s when they first built that section. Something about the grade and the angle, maybe, or just bad luck. But every few years, someone doesn't make it around that bend." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Local folks say the highway holds onto them, keeps their voices trapped in the asphalt and concrete. They try to warn other drivers, try to prevent what happened to them from happening to anyone else. I never ran that route again without hearing the whispers, though they were never as intense as they had been that first night. Over the years, I learned to listen to them, to heed their warnings about weather conditions, mechanical problems, and dangerous drivers ahead. The highway of whispers became my guardian as much as my burden, a constant reminder that the road remembers." Headlights that point to nowhere. From Marcus Chunda. Thing about driving nights is that your headlights become your whole world. Everything beyond those twin cones of yellow light just doesn't exist. And after 20 years hauling freight across the interstate system, I'd gotten comfortable with that arrangement. The darkness stayed in its lane, and I stayed in mine. That worked fine until the night I picked up that load in Bakersfield, bound for a distribution center outside Flagstaff. When my headlights started showing me places that weren't supposed to be there, it began as a perfectly ordinary run. My Kenworth was humming steady at 65, the diesel engine settling into that familiar rhythm that had lulled me through countless midnight miles. The radio was picking up some late-night talk show out of Phoenix. The host's voice, a comfortable murmur beneath the white noise of the road. October in the Mojave meant clear skies and cool air, perfect driving weather. I had my thermos of coffee, my route mapped out, and 8 hours to cover 400 miles. Everything was routine until I crested that unnamed hill about 2 hours east of Barstow. That's when I first noticed the headlights weren't illuminating what they should have been. Instead of the familiar stretch of asphalt and desert scrub I'd driven past hundreds of times before, the light revealed something else entirely. At first, I thought it was just fatigue playing tricks on my eyes. The beams seemed to be cutting through thick fog, though the night was crystal clear. Beyond the fog, I could make out what looked like structures, buildings that had no business being in the middle of the Mojave Desert. I slowed the rig down, squinting through the windshield. The dashboard clock read 2:13 in the morning, and the GPS showed I was exactly where I should be, following Interstate 40 through empty desert. But my headlights were painting a different picture entirely. They illuminated a narrow street lined with Victorian houses, their wraparound porches and gingerbread trim rendered in ghostly detail by the truck's lead beams. Lampposts stood at regular intervals, though they cast no light of their own. The whole scene had a peculiar, washed-out quality, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. I pulled over at the next rest area, a lonely concrete island in the desert darkness, and climbed down from the cab to check the headlights. Everything looked normal. The housings were clean, the bulbs bright and properly aligned. I walked around to the front of the truck and looked down the road in the direction I'd been traveling. In the distance, I could see the normal scatter of lights from a small town, probably Ludlow, exactly where it should be. Whatever I'd been seeing was gone. Back in the cab, I radioed my dispatcher just to check in, keeping my voice casual. Everything was fine, I told him, making good time. No problems with the load. I didn't mention the Victorian houses because I didn't want to end up taking a mandatory rest break while they figured out if I was having some kind of medical episode. I'd heard stories about drivers who reported strange sightings and found themselves sitting through psychological evaluations instead of making their delivery deadlines. I pulled back onto the highway, telling myself it had been a microsleep, one of those split-second dreams that can hijack your brain when you're tired. But I wasn't tired. The coffee was still warm in my cup. The radio was still clear, and I felt as alert as I ever did on a night run. More importantly, when I looked ahead into the reach of my headlights, the Victorian street was still there. This time, I could see more details. The houses were old, probably from the 1890s, with steep pitched roofs and ornate trim work. Most of them were dark, but a few showed the warm glow of oil lamps in their windows. As I drove forward, the scene moved with me, as if my headlights were a spotlight following actors across a stage. I could see a horse-drawn wagon parked in front of one house, and what looked like a woman in a long dress standing on a porch. She seemed to be looking directly at me. The strangest part was how normal it all felt. I was driving my truck down a modern interstate highway while simultaneously traveling down a 19th century residential street. And somehow both things were equally real. The engine continued its steady rumble. The GPS continued tracking my progress along I-40, but my headlights were revealing a completely different world. I found myself wondering if this was what it felt like to lose your mind, this calm acceptance of impossible things. I tried adjusting the headlight angle from inside the cab, but that only changed the view slightly. Instead of the middle of the street, I was now looking at the upper stories of the houses, revealing dormer windows and weather vanes. In one of those upper windows, I saw a child's face pressed against the glass, watching my truck pass. The child raised one small hand in what might have been a wave. The radio crackled with static, and when it cleared, the talk show host was gone. Instead, I heard what sounded like a church service, a preacher's voice rising and falling in rhythms I couldn't quite follow. The words seemed to be English, but they had an old-fashioned cadence that made them hard to understand. Behind the preaching, I could hear a congregation responding, their voices harmonizing in hymns that sounded ancient and mournful. I reached for the radio dial to find a different station, but as my hand moved toward the dashboard, I saw something that made me freeze. In the headlight beams, a man was walking down the center of the Victorian street, directly toward my truck. He was wearing a dark suit and a bowler hat, and he carried what looked like a medical bag. As he approached, he began to wave his arms over his head, flagging me down as if he needed help. My foot moved toward the brake pedal automatically. This was what you did when someone needed assistance. But then I realized the impossibility of the situation. I was driving on Interstate 40 in the 21st century. There was no Victorian street, no man in a bowler hat. If I stopped for him, what exactly would I be stopping for? What would I tell the highway patrol if they found me parked in the middle of the desert, claiming I'd been trying to help a pedestrian who couldn't possibly exist? The man in the bowler hat was getting closer, his mouth moving as if he was shouting, though I couldn't hear anything over the engine noise and the strange radio sermon. His face was pale and drawn, and there was something desperate in his expression. As he approached the front of my truck, he reached out with both hands, pressing his palms against something that must have been my bumper, though I couldn't see him making contact with anything real. That's when I did something I'd never done in 20 years of long-haul driving. I closed my eyes while moving down the highway, not for long, just for a count of 3, but long enough to break whatever connection had formed between my headlights and that impossible street. When I opened them, the road ahead was exactly what it should be, empty asphalt stretching toward the scattered lights of Ludlow. The radio had returned to the Phoenix talk show, the host discussing weather patterns with a caller from Tucson. My GPS showed normal progress along my route. The dashboard clock read 2:47, which meant I'd lost about 30 minutes somewhere in that strange interlude, though it had felt much shorter. I checked the odometer and found that I'd traveled the exact distance I should have, given my speed and elapsed time. Somehow, I'd been in 2 places at once, covering real highway miles while driving through a town that existed only in the beam of my headlights. I made the rest of the drive to Flagstaff without incident, delivered my load on schedule, and grabbed some breakfast at a truck stop before finding a motel room for some sleep. I figured a few hours of rest would help me make sense of what had happened, or at least convince me that it had all been some kind of hallucination, brought on by too much coffee and too many night shifts. But that evening, when I climbed back into the cab for the return trip to California, I found myself dreading the approach of darkness. The sunset seemed to last forever, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple that gradually deepened toward black. When I finally had to turn on the headlights somewhere west of Flagstaff, I held my breath and waited to see what they would illuminate. For the first hour, everything was normal. The beams showed me the familiar landscape of the high desert, the scattered Joshua trees and distant mesas that marked this stretch of the interstate. I began to relax, convincing myself that the previous night had been an anomaly, perhaps caused by some unusual atmospheric condition that had acted like a lens, somehow projecting images from another time and place. Then, just as I was starting to feel confident again, the headlights began to reveal something new. This time, it wasn't a Victorian street, but what looked like a desert trading post from the Old West. The circle route from Marcus Dane, the GPS gave me the strangest directive I'd ever received in 23 years of long-haul trucking. Follow Highway 77 north for exactly 47 miles. Then take only right turns until you reach your destination. No left turns permitted on this route. The dispatch note was handwritten in faded blue ink, attached to a delivery contract worth more than I'd made in the past 3 months combined. The cargo manifest simply read miscellaneous freight, with a delivery address that my regular GPS couldn't seem to locate, though the company-issued unit in my Peterbilt seemed to know exactly where we were headed. I'd picked up the trailer from a warehouse on the outskirts of Bakersfield just as the sun was painting the desert sky in shades of amber and rust. The facility looked abandoned from the outside, its parking lot cracked and sprouting weeds, but the loading dock was operational and my paperwork checked out. The dock supervisor, a thin man with nervous eyes, barely spoke as he watched me back up to Bay 7. He kept glancing at his watch and muttering something about timing, about making sure I followed the route exactly as specified. When I asked about the no left turns restriction, he just shrugged and said the roads were tricky out there, that the GPS knew best. The weight felt right as I pulled away from the dock. Maybe 30,000 pounds of something that didn't shift or rattle. The trailer rode smooth and quiet behind me, almost eerily so. Usually, freight makes some kind of noise when you take corners or hit bumps. But whatever I was hauling seemed to absorb every vibration, every jolt from the road. The silence was so complete, it made me conscious of every other sound. The steady rumble of my Cummins engine, the whisper of wind across my side mirrors, the rhythmic thump of tires over expansion joints in the asphalt. Highway 77 stretched ahead like a gray ribbon through the gathering dusk, and I settled into the familiar meditation of driving. The landscape was typical Central Valley terrain at first. Flat agricultural fields giving way to rolling hills dotted with oak trees. But as the miles accumulated on my odometer, something about the scenery began to feel off. The hills seemed to repeat themselves, not quite the same, but similar enough to create an unsettling sense of déjà vu. Every few miles, I'd crest a rise and see the same cluster of 3 oak trees, the same red barn with a sagging roof, the same abandoned gas station with its rusted sign hanging at the exact same angle. The first mandated right turn came at mile marker 47, just as the GPS had promised. The computerized voice, usually female and pleasant, had developed an odd electronic warble that made every instruction sound like a question. Turn right in 500 feet, it would say, as if uncertain of its own programming. The road it directed me onto was narrower than Highway 77. 2 lanes of older asphalt that curved through hills, covered in chaparral and manzanita bushes. My headlights carved through the deepening darkness, illuminating the yellow center line that seemed to glow with an intensity that made my eyes water. 3 miles down this new road, the GPS instructed another right turn, this one onto what appeared to be a county route, marked only by a small green sign, too faded to read clearly. The surface here was rougher, and I had to slow the rig to keep the trailer tracking properly through the curves. The strange thing was how the curves only bent to the right. Every single turn, every deviation from straight ahead, curved clockwise. Even the gentlest sweeping turns that barely registered on my steering wheel somehow managed to avoid any leftward deviation whatsoever. After the 5th right turn, I began to feel a creeping unease that had nothing to do with the darkness or the unfamiliar roads. I'd been driving for nearly 2 hours since leaving the warehouse, but according to my GPS, I was still only 37 miles from my destination. The math didn't work. At an average speed of 45 miles per hour on these winding roads, I should have been 90 miles away from my starting point, not circling back toward it. Yet the GPS showed my location as a slow spiral moving ever closer to the delivery point. Marked with a pulsing red dot, the radio had been picking up nothing but static for the past hour, occasionally broken by fragments of what sounded like the same song playing over and over. A country tune from the 70s about a truck driver who took a wrong turn and ended up somewhere he'd never been before. The lyrics were hard to make out through the interference, but the melody was hypnotic, almost matching the rhythm of my turn signals as I navigated yet another mandatory right turn onto an even smaller road. By 10 o'clock, I realized I was seeing the same landmarks again, but from different angles. There was the red barn, now on my left instead of my right. The cluster of 3 oak trees appeared ahead of me, though I was certain I'd passed them an hour ago, going the opposite direction. The abandoned gas station materialized in my headlights like a mirage, its rusted sign still hanging at that curious angle. But now the building faced a different direction entirely, as if it had rotated to match my new approach. The GPS continued its warbling directions, each right turn taking me onto progressively smaller roads, until I was navigating single-lane asphalt that barely accommodated my trailer. The route numbers on the occasional road signs made no sense, combinations of letters and numbers I'd never seen in any state. Route 77 BRC, County Road Infinity 212, Highway 77 CRC. The signs themselves looked official. The same green background and white lettering used by highway departments across the country, but the symbols were wrong, incorporating curves and loops that seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. My fuel gauge, which had read 3/4 full when I left Bakersfield, still showed 3/4 full despite hours of driving. The odometer continued to advance normally, showing I'd traveled over 200 miles, but the trip meter that I'd reset at the warehouse remained stubbornly stuck at 47 miles. Even more disturbing, my logbook clock showed 10:15 p.m., but the digital clock on my dashboard insisted it was still 8:30. The exact time I'd made my first right turn off Highway 77. The landscape outside had taken on a dreamlike quality that made me question my own perception. Hills rolled past that were simultaneously familiar and impossible. their contours following mathematical curves that should have led me in straight lines, but somehow always resulted in another clockwise turn. The chaparral bushes grew in perfect spirals, their branches wound tight like DNA helixes, reaching toward a star-filled sky that seemed to rotate slowly overhead, as if I were watching time-lapse photography of the Earth's rotation accelerated beyond natural speed, at what my dashboard claimed was still 8:30 p.m. I crested a hill and saw lights ahead, the first signs of civilization I'd encountered since leaving the main highway. The lights formed a perfect circle, like a small town built around a traffic rotary. And as I descended toward them, I could see that was exactly what it was. Buildings surrounded a central roundabout, their windows glowing with warm yellow light that should have been welcoming but instead filled me with a dread I couldn't name. The GPS announced my arrival in that questioning tone. Destination reached, but there was no loading dock, no warehouse, no place to deliver a trailer, just the roundabout with its circle of buildings and a single road leading into it, the same road I'd been following. I had no choice but to enter the traffic circle, and as my trailer cleared the entrance, I realized there was no exit. The roundabout was a perfect loop with no other roads branching off. I was trapped in an endless right turn, my trailer chasing my tractor in a circle barely large enough to accommodate my rig. The buildings surrounding the roundabout were facades, I realized, as I passed them for the second time. They had windows and doors and signs advertising businesses that couldn't possibly exist. Clockwise diner, turn right for service. Spiral motel, always arriving, never departing. Route 77 truck stop, no left turns since 1977. The windows were lit from within, but nothing moved behind them. The signs were painted in fonts that hurt my eyes. Letters that curved slightly upward, as if they were part of the same endless spiral that had guided my route. I tried to radio for help, but my CB picked up only the sound of other truckers in the same predicament, their voices fading in and out of the static like ghosts. Breaker 19. Anybody know how to get out of this circle? Been going around for 3 hours now. Fuel gauge won't budge. This is Moose, southbound on the roundabout. Anybody got a 20 on an exit ramp? The voices multiplied until they became a chorus of confused drivers, all of us circling the same impossible loop. All of us carrying cargo to a destination that existed but couldn't be reached. The azure signal from Marcus, the dashboard of my Peterbilt 379, had been glowing that peculiar shade of blue for 3 nights running, and I still couldn't figure out what was causing it. It wasn't the usual amber glow of the instrument cluster or the soft green of the radio display. This was something else entirely, a deep cerulean light that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, emanating from somewhere behind the gauges where no light should be. I'd pulled into truck stops twice to check the electrical system, even had a mechanic in Bakersfield take a look, but he couldn't find anything wrong, said everything was running normal, voltage steady. No shorts in the wiring. But every night, when the sun went down and I fired up the engine for another stretch of highway, that blue glow would return, bathing the entire cab in an otherworldly luminescence that made my skin look pale and corpse-like in the rear view mirror. Tonight found me rolling through the Nevada desert on Interstate 80, hauling a load of computer equipment bound for Salt Lake City. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions. broken only by distant mountain silhouettes against the star-drunk sky. My CB radio crackled occasionally with the lonely voices of other night drivers, but mostly it was just me and the steady drone of the diesel engine, the whisper of tires on asphalt, and that persistent blue glow painting everything in my cab with its strange light. The temperature gauge read normal, the oil pressure steady, all systems green across the board. Yet that blue radiance continued to pulse from behind the dashboard, growing brighter as the hours wore on. Bright enough now that I could see it reflecting off the chrome of my gear shifter and the surface of my coffee thermos. Around 2 in the morning, I noticed something else. The blue light wasn't just illuminating the dashboard anymore. It was beginning to spill out onto the highway itself, casting an azure cone of light beyond my headlights. At first, I thought it might be some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, maybe the northern lights dipping unusually far south, but the glow was definitely coming from inside my truck. I could see it in my side mirrors, painting the trailer behind me in that same ethereal blue, making the entire rig look like some kind of ghostly apparition moving through the desert night. Other vehicles that passed me seemed to react strangely to the light. I watched a sedan that had been gaining on me suddenly slow down and fall back. The driver's silhouette hunched forward over the steering wheel as if trying to get a better look at what he was seeing. The radio started acting up. Around mile marker 247, static would burst through in waves, sometimes resolving into what sounded almost like voices, but speaking in a language I couldn't identify. The words had a rhythmic quality, like a chant or prayer, rising and falling in cadence with the pulsing of the blue light. I tried switching channels, but the voices followed me across the spectrum, growing clearer with each adjustment. There were multiple speakers now, men and women, maybe even children, all intoning that same strange litany in perfect unison. The sound made the hair on my neck stand up, not because it was threatening, but because it was beautiful in a way that felt fundamentally wrong. Like hearing angels sing a funeral dirge, I pulled into a rest area near Winnemucca, hoping to get some distance from whatever was happening in my cab. But as soon as I shut off the engine, the blue glow intensified, spreading beyond the confines of the dashboard to fill the entire cab with pulsing light. The voices on the radio grew louder, more insistent, and now I could see that the light was affecting other things as well. The chrome fixtures in the sleeper berth were glowing. The aluminum trim around the windows blazed with cold fire, and even the metal clasps on my logbook had taken on that same azure radiance. I grabbed a flashlight from the side pocket and stepped out of the truck, thinking maybe I could see what was causing the phenomenon from the outside. What I saw made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The entire truck was glowing. Not just glowing, but radiating that blue light like it was being lit from within by some tremendous energy source. The light passed right through the metal and glass, as if they were transparent, revealing the internal structure of the vehicle in stark detail. I could see the engine block, the transmission, the frame rails, all outlined in that ghostly blue radiance. But more disturbing were the shapes moving within the light, humanoid figures that seemed to be made of the same energy, walking through the cab and trailer as if they were exploring every inch of the vehicle. They moved with purpose, examining the controls, running their luminous hands over the seats and walls, clustering around the dashboard where the light was brightest. The voices from the radio had grown so loud now that I could hear them clearly, even outside the truck. They were coming from the figures themselves, I realized. Some kind of communication between beings that existed in a spectrum of reality I couldn't fully perceive. As I watched, one of the figures turned toward me, and though it had no features I could distinguish, I felt the weight of its attention, like a physical presence. It raised what might have been an arm and pointed directly at me, and the blue glow suddenly flared so bright that it washed out my vision completely. When I could see again, all the figures had turned toward me, dozens of them now, filling every available space in and around my truck. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the spectacle before me. The logical part of my mind insisted this was some kind of hallucination. Maybe carbon monoxide poisoning or exhaustion-induced psychosis. But the light was real. I could feel its warmth on my face, see it reflecting off the windows of other vehicles in the rest area. A few other drivers had emerged from their cabs and were staring at my truck in obvious amazement and fear. One of them, an older man in a Freightliner cap, approached me cautiously. "Son," he said in a voice barely above a whisper, "what in the hell is that thing?" I started to explain about the dashboard, about the 3 nights of strange glowing, but before I could get more than a few words out, the light began to pulse faster, more urgently. The voices rose to a crescendo, and suddenly every electronic device in the rest area began to activate simultaneously. Street lights flickered, vending machines hummed to life, car alarms wailed, and the emergency phone near the restrooms began ringing incessantly. The blue light was spreading now, flowing across the ground like luminous fog, touching everything it encountered and causing it to glow with that same otherworldly radiance. That's when I realized the figures weren't just exploring my truck. They were using it as some kind of beacon, a transmission point for whatever reality they inhabited. The dashboard had somehow become a conduit between their world and ours, and with each passing hour, the connection was growing stronger. I could see more of them now, emerging from the light, like swimmers surfacing from deep water, their forms becoming more solid, more present. They began to spread out from the truck, moving toward the other vehicles, toward the building, toward us. The older driver grabbed my arm. "We need to get out of here," he said, and I couldn't have agreed more. But as I turned to run, I realized something terrifying. The keys to my truck were still in the ignition, and without that rig, I had no way to make a living, no way to survive. The truck represented everything I owned, my entire life invested in steel and chrome and diesel fuel. I couldn't just abandon it to whatever these things were, no matter how frightened I was. Against every instinct screaming at me to flee, I ran back toward the cab. The blue light seemed to welcome me, parting like a curtain as I approached. The figures watched me climb into the driver's seat, their attention focused and intense. The voices on the radio had changed again, becoming more melodic, almost welcoming. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life, the blue glow pulsing in rhythm with the diesel rumble. As I put the truck in gear and pulled out of the rest area, I saw in my mirrors that the other lights were fading, the figures withdrawing back into whatever dimension they called home. I drove through the rest of the night, with that blue glow painting everything in its strange light. The voices on the radio singing their incomprehensible songs. By dawn, Both the light and the voices had faded to barely perceptible levels, and by the time I pulled into Salt Lake City, you'd never know anything unusual had happened. The dashboard looked perfectly normal, all gauges reading steady. No sign of the phenomenon that had transformed my truck into a beacon for otherworldly visitors. But every night, when the sun goes down and I fire up the engine for another run, I can see that faint blue glow beginning to build behind the instrument panel. It's getting stronger each time, more persistent. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I can hear those voices whispering just below the threshold of audibility. I've started to wonder if the figures weren't just exploring that night in Nevada,